So wait, they're calling back inactive individual reservists to serve, but not the units that are being paid and trained. Why not? They're saving them for a larger war? But that sounds wrong somehow, you know? Yeah. Oh. September 30th, 1951. A commander refusing a direct order can be, and very often is, removed from command. And yet UN Commander Matt Ridgway says this week that there is one order, one pretty likely to be given by US President Harry Truman, he will not obey. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week saw the first large-scale troop reinforcement of a battlefield by helicopter. It also saw the continuation of the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge, and the UN forces were not making much progress. That battle continues all this week. Diversionary attacks by US 9th Regiment against Hill 1024 and Hill 1142 by ROK, South Korean, 7th Division actually make pretty good progress early in the week. On the 25th, the former's crest is cleared of the enemy, and on the 26th, the latter. For the North Koreans, this compromises nearby Hill 867, which dominates the valley to the north. So they send in the 3rd Regiment from KPA, North Korean, 6th Division. This does not make it any easier for the UN forces, though. 23rd Regiment is still under heavy fire, trying to take Hill 931. The 1st Battalion is still trying to push north to the crest, and the French Battalion has replaced the 2nd Battalion and is trying to move south along the ridgeline. The regimental tanks do manage to get in close enough to fire directly at some of the enemy bunkers covering the eastern approaches to the ridge. So there's that. But the enemy mortars and machine guns are still very much operational. After almost 2 weeks of futile pounding at the enemy's defenses on Heartbreak, Colonel Adams told General Young on September 26 that it was suicide to continue adhering to the original plan. Young is Robert Young, the new 2nd Division commander, and Adams is James Adams, who commands 23rd Regiment. That regiment has taken nearly 1,000 casualties. Adams wants to do what John Lynch, 9th Regiment commander, suggested last week: broaden the attack to disperse the enemy's capacity to resist on Heartbreak Ridge. See, if they attack the other KPA forces in the area, then they hopefully won't be able to send men and material to the ridge when they're engaged, and the 23rd would soon wear down the troops on the ridge and would take it. Young and 10th Corps Commander Clovis Byers are soon enough talked around to thinking this might work, and attacks on the ridge by the 23rd Regiment are called off September 27th. 2nd Division G3 Operations Chief Tom Mellon spends the rest of the week putting together a plan to hopefully avoid earlier mistakes. The plan calls for the 3 regiments of 2nd Division to launch coordinated and concentrated attacks with not only the support of all of the divisional artillery, but also a full-scale armored thrust by the 72nd Tank Battalion, and an advance by an armored infantry task force. The plans should be finalized in a day or two, and I imagine the attack will go off not long after that. If you were wondering what the earlier mistakes are, analyzing the initial attempts of the 2nd Division to take Heartbreak, Young characterized them as a fiasco because of the piecemeal commitment of units and the failure to organize fire support teams. The enemy mortars were especially effective, he pointed out, causing about 85% of the division's casualties up to this point. And all of those casualties need to be replaced in the battle lines. And as for the replacement troops, the newcomers from the States via Japan, the men who came in now were selectees for the most part. They knew there was a war on. They knew it would be hard, which was a help. Most of them knew very little else. A great many of them did not last long enough to learn more. When a group of 100 or more of them arrives, 2nd Division Assistant Commander Hayden Boatner meets them and talks to them. One issue he has is that the junior officer positions are often being filled by reservists who have been recalled to service. So you get lieutenants over 30 and captains nearly 40 years old. These are guys that got commissioned in World War II, did their jobs, and then went home. The huge majority of them did not remain active. They have families and jobs at home. The Judge Advocate General has ruled, though, that any man who once had a commission can legally be recalled whether or not he's kept it active. And the Pentagon, when the Chinese poured across the Yalu, had made an incalculable error, one that would damage the Army Reserve program for a decade. Never certain that a big war would not start any minute, the Pentagon called not the officers and men in Table of Organizations units receiving pay and training, but the bulk of the inactive reservists, men who had received neither and whose interest was less. The inactive individuals could be called up for fillers. The units were kept in reserve for a bigger war. That bigger war has not come, and it may never come. So you have the situation where there are hundreds of thousands of National Guardsmen organized in units, kept at home in the States, and some 40,000 reserve officers called involuntarily back to service and sent to Korea. Also, because of the rotation system I talked about a few weeks ago, it is not that common for whole units to be sent to Korea at all anymore. Hundreds of thousands of people have been sent in as individual replacements, arriving in new divisions knowing no one. Do they develop a strong affinity for this new division in which they have never trained? I don't know. Maybe they just do their time until they can leave again. But it must feel awful to arrive to war friendless and mostly alone. Of course, it's not just Americans, Koreans, and Chinese fighting the war. A few weeks ago, Operation Minden took place to establish the Commonwealth Division, the units from the British Commonwealth of Nations, north of the Imjin River. Once this was done, they are ready for their next operation, Operation Commando, the taking of the high ground that marks the Jamestown line. There are also plans afoot to advance farther to the Fargo line if necessary. But to get to Jamestown calls for an advance of between 6 and 8 kilometers, depending which brigade is advancing. This is actually an operation for all of 1st Corps, but I'll talk about the rest of the divisions doing it next week. I wanted to highlight the Commonwealth Division's part in it this week, as it is the division's first major operation since being consolidated 2 months ago. The key to the Chinese position lay in a clutch of hills in the northwest corner of the divisional objective. From the summit of the highest of these, the 355-meter Kaesong San, or Little Gibraltar, the Chinese commanded superb views of all of the country down to and across the Imjin. It was therefore essential to drive them off this feature and from another hill, Maryang San, some 2 miles due north, from where a good overview of the enemy's rear areas could be expected. The Commonwealth Division's front is like 15 kilometers long, and its right flank runs up against a north-south section of the Imjin right by its junction with the Hantan River. Division Commander James Castles is going to use 2 brigades for the operation, the 28th Commonwealth Brigade and the 25th Canadian Brigade. Now, Maryang San and Kaesong San are held by a Chinese regiment, the 571st, 3 battalions strong. They are well dug in. They have plenty of mortar and artillery support, so the operation is not likely to be a cakewalk. But of course, casualties are still to be kept to a minimum. To try to achieve that balance, they're going to use an overdose of firepower. 3 Royal Artillery field regiments, as well as American artillery, even heavy artillery, and mortar units, as well as the guns of the 8th Hussars tanks, on as high ground as they can get to. And of course, airstrikes. Well, Castles has spent this week talking to his officers because George Taylor and his 28th Commonwealth Brigade are given the main task of taking Little Gibraltar a few days from now on October 3rd, and John Rockingham's Canadians are to go in the next day to clear the lower hills to the south so Maryang San can be taken. In general, the 28th Commonwealth Division is facing the Chinese 191st Division, which is no slouch, and Taylor specifically the 571st Regiment. In this case, the defenders outnumber the attackers, but Taylor thinks the artillery and aerial support will win the day. We will see how it goes next week. There are meetings between representatives of the enemy sides this week. The Communist and UN liaison officers meet the 24th and 25th to discuss a few things. Among them, the possibility of a new site for peace negotiations, not Kaesong like before. That is what UN Commander Matt Ridgway wants. The communist side insists that at least the first meeting be held at Kaesong. But Ridgway figures that if even one meeting is held there, any arguments for a change of scenery lose force, so he digs in his heels. This leads to more meetings in Washington. The Joint Chiefs of Staff now support Ridgway. State is still worried that a Kaesong refusal might blow up any talks whatsoever. In this, State prevails. An Army Chief of Staff Lightning Joe Collins phones Ridgway to tell him. He still refuses, though, and even lays his career on the line. He says, "I shall continue to do my utmost to execute faithfully your instructions, whatever be your decision on this issue of renewing delegation meetings in Kaesong. Unless, however, your decision should be to direct me to resume delegation meetings at Kaesong, I shall refrain from doing so." This is heavy. Ridgway saying he would refuse a direct order. Now, should such an order be issued, and he does refuse it, President Harry Truman would have no choice but to remove him from command, like with Douglas MacArthur. However, Ridgway has huge global prestige, and he's the guy everyone credits with saving 8th Army last winter. It's kind of unthinkable for him to be fired. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Omar Bradley, has plans for a trip to Europe to deal with NATO stuff, but decides he should go to Tokyo right now and talk to Ridgway in person. Chip Bolin goes with him. He is a Soviet expert at State, and he's going along to offer Ridgway his expertise negotiating with communists and to look at things firsthand for State. Ridgway and Washington have divergent views on the whole situation, not just his colorful language or the issues of Kaesong. See, a bunch of people in Washington think the communist side is still reaping military benefits from the truce talks, building up during the lull for new offensives. So the communists are in no hurry to get anything signed, and they want to draw them out. So Washington should push for an armistice as soon as possible, even with more concessions. I say the communists, but that doesn't really include the USSR, who had every reason, at least in August, to speed up the peace process ahead of the San Francisco Conference. Ridgway, on the other hand, thinks after the past 6 weeks, the enemy is really hurting militarily. And that, and the prospect of another brutal winter campaign, makes them pretty eager to sign an armistice. So exactly 0 further concessions should be given. Well, Bradley and Bolin arrive in Tokyo the 29th. They talk to Ridgway and UN Chief Delegate Turner Joy. They go to Korea and meet 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet. And they also get a pretty good tour of the battlefield. They are still talking and trying to narrow this divergence between Ridgway and Washington as the week ends. And with a couple of notes, this week of the war for me is at an end. On the 29th in the U.S., the draft numbers for the month of November are raised from 33,700 to 39,000. On the 30th, Joe Kelly succeeds Robert Terrell as commander of the Far Eastern Air Force's Bomber Command. So that was another bloody week of the Korean War. More and more men dying at Heartbreak Ridge, replacements arriving alone to units of strangers, British plans for new operations, and Ridgway stubbornly trying to convince the powers that be how the situation actually is on the ground in Korea. Isidore Stone, in The Hidden History of the Korean War, quotes Van Fleet from September 12th, talking to correspondents. "My hope for peace is with United Nations military might. And right now, the enemy is hurt badly. We will hurt him much more before the winter is over, and then he will want peace. He will need peace, and badly, whether he attacks or just tries to sit out the winter." For months, though, as we've seen, it is the UN forces who've been on the offensive, not the enemy. And from July 10th, when the Kaesong talks began, until the last day of September, today, the Americans alone have taken 10,000 casualties, nearly 10,000 casualties. Van Fleet has this to say: "We suffered many of these casualties in taking hills which on the surface appeared minor in significance, but it was militarily essential to take those hills to deny the enemy commanding terrain in close proximity." He also adds that it is imperative that the 8th Army remain active to forestall the dreaded price of stagnation, absorbing new lessons and gradually learning the profession of fighting. He says that 8th Army is more and more like a combat school. Well, Stone writes, "Back home, we had been told that American lives had to be spilled in Korea to repel aggression. Now the generals were beginning to explain that Korea represented an opportunity to improve the fighting caliber of their armed forces. We were told that the repulse of the aggressors, forcing them back across the 38th parallel, would reestablish law and order. This was no longer liberating Korea. It was using the unhappy country as a ground for live field exercises. Strong words. And will this all continue? Well, I can't see the future, but as it develops, I will be here to bring it to you, and that is all thanks to the Time Ghost Army. Time Ghost Army member of the week here is Igor Griffiths. Or maybe he's Igor, like in Young Frankenstein, but Igor or Igor Griffiths. Join our great adventure and be part of this at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. And do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.